Hi everyone, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I am talking to Sarah Schira, also known as Imagined Landscapes. She is the talented designer behind many knitted accessories like hats, shawls, and mittens, but she is also the creative mind behind the charming knitted gnomes. Her Gnome Knitalongs are more than just a collaborative crafting event, they are vibrant, seasonal celebrations within the knitting community. Her cows have become beloved traditions that bring knitters together from all over the world. Welcome, Sarah. I'm so glad you could make the time to chat to us.
Well, if you're just going to flatter me the whole time, I'm here for it. That was one of the nicest put things. I'm going to have to steal your phrasing. I really enjoyed how you put that. I think the knit-alongs are amazing and they are vibrant and they are astonishingly community based. Like, I just think it is a miraculous corner of the internet where everyone is helpful, everyone's in a good mood, it feels like, and the stakes are really low because gnomes aren't high stakes. So it just seems like a really good time. So yeah, it's one of my favorite things.
Yeah, and the gnome knitting is, well, it's a very small project. It's not like your 5 skein mystery knit along shawl. So it is
Yeah.
just for a lot of people an easy way to get into mystery knit along knitting.
Yeah, and I mean, if you don't like it, it doesn't have to be colors that flatter you. It doesn't have to fit you. Like, if I always say that wonkiness is nominess. So if it's your first time doing a cable, or if it's your first time doing color work or whatever, like if you kind of make it look a bit weird or wild or whatever, often the gnome just looks better. Like, it actually looks more gnomey. So I think there is a real, like I said, it's very low stakes, and like you said, it's kind of bite size, and I try to really slow my clues down. Like, I've been a part of some knit-alongs where I felt like I had a part-time job, um, if not a full-time job. But I
Yeah.
always think I want parents of young children or shift workers to be able to keep up with my knit-alongs. So I slow them down, and then I usually add like at least 2 weeks at the end after the last clue is received. Like, most people can do it each clue in a couple hours, like they're just small. But even then, I put days between and I put weeks afterwards. I just want people to have fun and succeed. Like, I just want people to succeed. That's my big thing. It's why I do the tutorial videos, everything. I just want people to be having fun being themselves, you know?
Yeah, well, and you are doing an excellent job. So, can you share a bit about your background and how you first became interested in knitting and what led you specifically to designing the gnomes?
Oh, yeah. All right. So my background is as a cold Canadian. And I homeschooled our children from kindergarten right through grade 12. They're both in out at university or out in the world by now. And when you homeschool, there's sort of two ways to teach. And one way is to like find a program and like teach more like in a classroom where it's sort of top down and you're very structured. And the way we did it, because I just think it's way better. And one of the reasons we homeschooled is so that I could keep learning all the time, is to sort of learn side by side. And my daughter, at one point, we were reading something out loud, and I think it was Laura Ingalls Wilder, and they're knitting Christmas presents for each other. And she said, "Mama, I'd like you to teach me to knit." And she was maybe 7 or 8. And so we did the thing that everyone does when they're 7 or 8, is like, I taught her how to knit. And then she was like, "Great, check that off my life list, I'll move on." And which is what my omas did for me when I was about 8 years old. I remember knitting some very terrible rectangles. And I remember the yellow acrylic yarn, and I remember these weird flexible red needles, like they were plastic and they were terrible. And the plastic needles with blunt points and the squeaky acrylic yarn, yellow yarn, red needles. It was terrible. I hated knitting it. And I don't know that anyone like really made clear to me that I could knit a sweater if I just kept on a little bit. They kept being like, "It could be a scarf for your Barbie." But I wasn't a Barbie girl. Like, I didn't really care. That was not a motivating thing. So I also learned to knit, check mark, dropped it. But then when it was time to teach her, I taught her. And as I was working on our little projects together, something connected so deep inside me. Um, and I couldn't stop. And I think it comes down to a couple of things that at that stage in my life, knitting filled voids that I didn't have maybe the last time I tried it. But so as a full-time mother slash educator, everything I did was either invisible or completely undone at every moment. So invisible is like teaching someone else to read, or like giving them love, or, like we do something for weeks at a time on a project. And at the end, they would have the project to show and it wasn't mine. So things like my contribution was largely invisible, or it was undone. Like I'd wash the laundry, but then it would be dirty. You feed the kids, they need feeding again. But knitting stayed done. I could walk away and come back and it would still be knit. Like it's not like being hungry, and it was tangible and it was mine, and I could be proud of it and hold it up and like, look, mom, I did this. And I mean, a lot of the research I've done since has been about how, like simple knitting in particular triggers theta brainwaves, which is a lot like meditation. And I think as a mother, as somebody who needed my own outlet and who needed to be able to do things where I was sitting beside my kids. So like when you're homeschooling, a lot of what you need to do is like shut up and get out of the way. You teach them something and then they have to put it into practice. So you will go over the little math lesson for the day, and then you have to be there, but you have to not be going like, oh my goodness, Matthias, could you just focus? Sandra, would you stop putting your pencil in you have to just sit there and let them work through and like get bored and then remember they're in the middle of something, and you can't constantly be in their face, but you have to be intellectually available. And so knitting was perfect. I could knit beside them, get this enormous payoff, like feeling like a goddess of creativity, and then still be there. And if they had a question, I was available. And so it was like really this amazing confluence of like needs and situations. And I was cold. Like I said, I'm Canadian, in the prairies, and I'm just always cold. My son turns the air conditioning on and I'm like I have a big, huge shawl beside me, and I put it on in summer because I'm so cold in the air conditioning. And so that the knitting part is sort of came out of all of those circumstances. But the gnome thing, I can't really explain. And I wish I had a better answer for people. But the truth is, as long as I've known about gnomes, I've loved them. And it's a little, I can't trace it to a specific thing, but they've been around at craft markets, I think, my whole life. And I remember when I was in university the first year, so I was 18, we went to a craft market and there was this little tiny Santa, but he looked so much like a gnome. And I bought it for my mom. It was wood and carved. And I mean, I remember getting my first IKEA catalog when I was 12, and I don't think there were gnomes in it, but I loved that style. And I think there's something about like this, the Northern European aesthetic, and then the cute little gnomes. And then when I found someone's pattern, and I was like, wait, I can make gnomes and I don't have to wait to find them at the craft market. Like I could realize a gnome into being. And so I knit that, and then I knit it again. And then I was like, but what if the hat was blue? But what if I slowed the decreases down? But I don't want to sew the hat on. So how could I change how this is being knit? I want a flatter bottom. I want this, I want that. So I started I kept obsessively knitting, but I was changing the pattern like every time I was knitting it. And by that point, my kids were old enough that I was looking around and going, okay, well, they're going to be out of homeschooling at some point and I'm going to need a job. So what am I going to do? And I mean, they were unplanned. I was young. So I finished my first university degree, but my plan of going on to grad school and being a professor sort of was short-circuited. And so I was like, well, I don't really want to work at a grocery store or something like that. Like what I have unconventional talents as a homeschooling mother. I don't fit neatly into boxes. So what would I do out there in the world? That sounds kind of unpleasant. Let's see if I can make my own job. And I was obsessed with knitting. And I had right from the beginning, like I designed sweaters for the kids and for Reiner. And I was always sort of designing, but never designing for multiple sizes or whatever. I would design for the head in front of me. Like I would measure it and we'd figure things out. And I'd use the really great books that are out there that are sort of like, well, here's how to do hats in different gauges or whatever. But right from the beginning, I was like tinkering with my knitting. And so I decided to try designing. And I had this idea that I would start with some accessories. I would knit the accessories, design the accessories. I'd kind of figure out how designing worked, because there's just so much to being a small business person. You have to be a photographer, you have to be a photo editor, you have to be a social media person, you have to be able to write patterns, so you have to be a graphic layout person, you have to figure out taxes, you have to figure out how Ravelry works and how the different platforms work, and you have to figure out all this stuff on top of designing. So I thought I'll just start with accessories. This is a little less intimidating. Plus I can knit them more often than, say, a big sweater. And so I'll like figure some things out. I will do the accessories, and then I will graduate to what I thought I was going to be. I was going to be a grown-up designer. And I basically thought I was going to be Thea Coleman. I wanted to design cabled sweaters and just luxuriate, because like I said, I'm a cold Canadian. And so I wanted 1,000 sweaters in my wardrobe, all of which I had designed. And but I was trying to publish frequently to learn the ropes and to build up my audience. And I just thought, I've got this gnome pattern. I have got 3 different gnomes sizes that I kind of have, like my small, my medium, and my large. I've got really good notes. I don't have anything in mind. I'll just throw this out there. I will have it edited. I will have it test knit. We'll put it up. And then I thought 12 people would join me, right? I thought 12 people will knit this. I will go back to my design career. I will keep knitting gnomes in my spare time. And I mean, I was knitting gnomes so often that my son would walk into the room. And this was the time of year when this was back in the day when preteens thought hashtagging their parents was like the most vicious form of humor. So he'd like walk into the room, he'd be like, hashtag mama's never not gnoming. So I called the pattern Never Not Gnoming. And that's where that came from. It was him dissing me. And I turned it around. But I honestly thought I would be the only human being who was never not gnoming. And the response was enormous. And I was like, oh, wow, that was kind of awesome. And then I kind of went back to the other things. And it was like 2 years later when I put out my second pattern. And the second pattern blew up like beyond my wildest expectations. It is to this day my highest selling pattern. It's Here We Gnome Again. And it's the cabled gnome.
Do you have it there?
I don't have it with me. I grabbed a bunch of gnomes, but that's the one I did. I have so many patterns now that I have to like decide how many can I fit on the desk in front of me and behind me. I don't have it, but it's the one that has twisted stitch cables. And it is by far my best-selling pattern to this day. It outsells everything else at least twice, like twice as many sales of that pattern. And so then when I put that second one out, I was like, hang on, this is like actually starting to be a real thing. It's not just me and a couple of like people as crazy as me, as wild and weird and playful as me. There's like an actual unmet desire. And I love this. And if people will pay me to gnome for a living, I am all in. Like, I am not going to turn that opportunity down. And besides, Thea Coleman already exists. I don't need to be her. She's already being her. She's, it's a busy position. So that's how it all came together. It was like, it was just passion passion and curiosity over and over, like passion for being with my kids, but then also needing to do something, and then passion for knitting and just wanting to read everything I could, and passion for getting the design right. So always tinkering with things, passion for gnomes, and then just throwing it out in the world and assuming that it would just be like just a little thing, but it would be there. If anyone found it, they could knit it. And I would, like I said, just keep doing it on my own. But then everybody joined me and it was amazing. And I'm happy.
It is amazing. Yes. You answered about the first 4 questions with this beautiful story.
It's hard to get me to stop once I start talking about gnomes and knitting, because I think knitting's so satisfying. I have to often remember, Sarah, this is the time where you pause and you let other people talk too.
Oh no, do your thing. I'm really happy that you are so motivated to talk about your journey and your gnome knitting life. Mm-hmm. But where do you find the inspiration for your gnome characters? Do you draw from any particular stories or cultures or personal experiences?
I literally draw. So I have like an iPad with one of the Apple pencils, and I sketch, and I will be out and about, and I will see, I mean, right now gnomes are fairly popular. So I see them in garden centers, and I see them, in the dollar store as ornaments at Christmas or whatever. So I take photos of other gnomes. But honestly, I will be out for a walk, and I will come home, and I will have to sit down and sketch right away because I'll have 4 ideas. And I'm like, I had 2 ideas about a beard, and then another idea about a hat, and an idea about feet. And I will go and I will sketch them down and put them down. And then when it's time to actually design a gnome, then depending on the yarn and the time of year and kind of what I'm feeling like an itch for, I will then flip through all those sketches and say, okay, well, what 2 to 4 things do I want to bring into this? And then I'm really heavily influenced by knitting on the needles. Like, I'm not one of those designers who could ever sort of write things up and then send it to a sample knitter and have the sample knitter realize it. I have to be problem solving on the needles. I have to be ripping back and saying, no, that didn't work. And often it's right in the middle of knitting one gnome and having one problem. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking about solutions where I will have ideas for other gnomes. Because as I'm problem solving, I'm thinking, well, okay, no, that kind of stitch pattern won't solve this problem, but actually it could be cool if we do it like this. So I'll quickly sketch that down. And so I think for me, I'm just really, I think we overuse the word addicted. So I'd like someone to tell me the word to use that isn't, I'm really drawn to, I'm really excited by the personalities of each gnome and the personalities of the group. And then I think, oh, but what's the group missing? And, maybe the group is missing a really great cabled beard. And maybe the group is missing someone with a giant nose. It's just like, it's time for a really big nosed gnome. And so a lot of times it just kind of comes from looking around at things. But I just find they're such simple little shapes. They're silly little creatures that they're so easy to sort of sit down and sketch. Like, I'll just sketch a little triangle for the hat. I'm like, oh, that's kind of boring. What if the hat leaned over? What if we started getting a curl? Okay, how would I deal with that? There are a couple gnomes that are straight up inspired by something, and I did bring one, so we're lucky this time. One of the gnomes I grabbed was the sorting hat from Harry Potter. I was joking around that I needed to rip off the sorting hat, and so I did this one here where we welt in some places and we don't welt in others, so that you kind of get this nice rumpling. And then I would this here is very, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, it's a pattern. So it's like open, closed, and then the opposite sits on top. So this open bit sits on top of this closed bit. So it's very fitted and regular. But then as we get higher, I started doing things to sort of stop. It's less, more rumply, less regular. And I also did some things to help it curve. And so this was very much from a very specific real world something that I was seeing. I'm just loving that hat and the character of that hat, and thinking, how could I make knitted fabric look that textured and that rumpled, and where would that come from? And like flipping through a lot of stitch pattern books. Like, I've got a whole lot of books about the different stitch patterns, and I'll have sticky noted them. And what I've started doing now is just taking a picture of the page in the book with the pattern on it, like, so I can see the pattern, and then I'll put it into that little online sketch, or not online, but that digital sketchbook. So I can see, I don't have to have a note, see page 36, Barbara Walker's First Treasury. It's like, no, the picture's right there. And then I'll sketch around it and sort of say, oh, I think this texture could really work for a beard or something like that. And so, I mean, part of it is I designed this many because it's my business. And I think if I had not had sort of the business pushing me forward, like, and let's say I'm doing 3 mystery knit-alongs a year or something like that. So I need to come up with 3 gnomes a year minimum that I think are charming and worth people's time and worth people's money. I'm really cognizant of the fact that when people choose one of my patterns, they're not just giving me money. They're giving me time. They're giving me their free time. And I think that's extremely precious in our day and age. Most people in Europe and North America have a bit more money than they have free time. At least that's the way it feels like when you talk to people. And so for people to spend time with my patterns, I want them to have enough charm and enough newness that it justifies their time and their money. And so I definitely really think about that a lot. And I think that if I don't know how many I would have invented on my own if I wasn't selling them. I think I find knitting the same gnome 20 times with just a different hat color so compelling that I might have gotten lost sort of in, like, let's say 5 patterns rather than, I actually don't know how many I'm up to now. The book kind of shot things up, but I think I'm around 25 or 30 patterns now. And some of the patterns I put multiple gnomes in. So that's not even like how many gnomes. So anyways, the design is really, it differs. Sometimes I'm just problem solving, and sometimes I'm really inspired by the yarn. The dyer and I have been like, we'll talk about things, and they might say, oh, well, like I'm thinking fall rainbow. And I'm like, ooh, I like that. What do you mean by that? And they'll send me some ideas, and I'll be, oh, okay, so if we're doing kind of more of an autumnal gnome, and then like sort of a dustier kind of rainbow, that to me has maybe subtler design, maybe a simpler design, versus if I get really bright colors, then I might go like, this contrast is really high and the colors are really bright. So we can handle design elements that are like much bolder and maybe less conventional because the colors are so extreme or whatever. So it's really, there's no one thing inspiring me except for enjoying my job and wanting other people to enjoy what I'm bringing to the world. I think that's the only constant out there.
And that is just beautiful, the way you put it. And I really like the different characters of your gnomes. And I was wondering, your mystery Knitalongs are a huge hit. And how do you come up with the storylines for this event? But so people might not know this, but like last December's gnome, I did keep up knitting it. And you don't only send out pieces of the pattern on a regular basis, but there's a whole storyline, and there are recipes, and there was, I don't know the English word, that you could color.
There's like coloring pages or gift tags, depending on the gnome.
Yeah, exactly. How do you come up with this whole storyline and all the things that you want to put in there?
It's really interesting. So the first, I'm gonna dial back a bit to get to this. Like, we'll talk about where the stories first came. So when I put out my first knitting pattern, Never Not Gnoming, there were 3 gnomes. There's Norbert, who's the largest. This is a slightly varied version of Norbert, but there's Norbert, and then there was Natasha, and then there was Norbert, Natasha, and the littlest one was Nicholas. And I don't have Nicholas because he has a rounded bottom because he was meant to be an ornament. So he doesn't stand nicely on my desk when I'm doing these talks. And these are knit for a friend who's a big football fan. And so this is going to be a care package. I need to knit one more football, and then they're going to go off. It's his sports team. But so I knit all 3 of these. But if you've ever bought advertising on Ravelry, so Ravelry has really great discussion boards. And at the very bottom, there's a little strip of advertising, and it is the most darndest shape to try to fill. As a graphic design, it is such a cursed shape. Almost nothing fits in that little skinny strip. It's like smaller than a ruler. If you go to send your kid to school with a ruler, it's smaller than that. And so I had sort of like a little gnome, and then this big, huge white space, like just this enormous white space. So I like maybe did a zoomed portion of the gnome. Okay, so then I had 60% white space, and I hated that white space. So I just started typing, and I typed something like, Natasha's from New Zealand and likes artisanal pickles. And I laughed and I laughed and I laughed. And then I wrote something about Norbert, and then I wrote something about Nicholas, and I laughed and I threw those ads into Ravelry. I was like, okay, this may be the worst business decision of my life, but I thought it was funny. So I just went with it. And I was, like when you're a small business, you can take risks before things are really established, right? Like I wasn't Nike or somebody doing this. Like I was just me, just having fun. And so literally the first story, the pattern was originally published without those stories. I went back in later when I was because I always go back and I upgrade my patterns, especially the early ones. Because since then I've started doing video tutorials. So if I shoot a video tutorial and I think it would go well on a pattern, I'll go back, edit it in, and then re-upload that and send it out to everybody. So the first versions of the Never Not Gnoming pattern didn't have the stories. They just had names. And I think actually the stories are a big part of why people enjoy the gnomes, is because they're not just a knitting thing anymore. They're a personality, and people will often write their own little stories. They'll like, well, my Norbert doesn't like hang gliding. My Norbert is a yoga instructor, or or they'll say mine isn't a Norbert. Mine is a whatever. So they'll rename them, like, oh, I'm going to name it after my cousin because and I'm going to give it to my brother-in-law, or whatever it is. So I think the personality kind of came into it, and is part of why people enjoy it. I think it gives them a doorway into the playfulness. But so that the stories weren't even meant to be, but once I started, I couldn't stop. And I mean, I'm kind of a failed writer. I wanted to be a writer my whole life. I remember in third grade sitting down to write a novel so that I could be a successful author. And I have submitted multiple children's books and other things. Like I love writing. I really do. I love story. I love reading out loud. We read out loud as a family. Like I'll even now to this day, like corner my kids with a book. And so we did chapter books. My husband and I, way back in university days, I used to read out loud to him. We didn't have cable TV. We'd be in the middle of exam stress, and we would sit on the couch and I would read Anne of Green Gables to him. Because strangely, as a German teenage boy, he hadn't read them. I don't know what was going on. But so I love story and I love language. And the fact that gnomes let me put in these little ones. So every gnome gets at least a 2-sentence little story. But the December gnomes are really special. That knit-along, it's not just a knit-along. It's like a whole event. It's a whole gift I'm trying to give people as I love them through a busy month. And it is a busy month for most people in the Northern Hemisphere. If you're celebrating Christmas or any of the adjacent holidays, it's big. It's a busy time of year. And so I don't believe that anybody should be told to knit every day in December. I think that's outrageous. But I wanted to send people something every day in December because I think I believe that anticipation is like 90% of what constitutes joy. It's thinking something good is coming. And then it arrives and you're like, yeah, that was great. But like the moment before you bite the first bite of cheesecake, the packing for the vacation, the reading the book cover, but not starting the book yet. That anticipation, I think, is an enormous part of joy. And so I wanted to send people things every day, but I didn't want to tell them to knit. So I was like, well, what am I going to do? And so I just said, oh, I'm going to throw the stories in there. And again, I assumed most people wouldn't like them, that they'd just kind of tolerate them. And then they'd get to the knitting part, and that would be like the real part for them. But once again, I have underestimated. I guess I keep thinking I'm like an out of the ordinary adult, but I think a lot of us are out of the ordinary adults, and we really enjoy a wider variety of things than maybe mass media would lead us to believe the rest of the people around us are like. So the next time you're on mass transit, just remember there's a lot of people doing a lot of weird things and being very playful in their lives that you wouldn't think based on their outfits, because they're doing things like reading gnome stories. So the process, though, is tricky because I can't show the gnome until the knitting is done. So writing the story is actually really difficult because I have to come up with a plot line centered around a gnome who cannot be visible, right? Because then the surprise is spoiled. So the first one I wrote, and that was a really powerful one. The first one was it was 2020, and I'd had the idea and I was making plans before the pandemic hit. And I was knitting the prototype in March in the middle of the first lockdowns. But again, none of us knew what was really going to happen with the pandemic and that the way things were going to shake down. But so I was thinking, like, it was already a rough spring for a lot of people, and I just kept thinking, like I said, about this as a December event about joy and about community, and I just started to write. And so the very first one is about, I invented a gnomish holiday based on the winter solstice called Longest Night, spelled with a G-N. And the idea that they would have a Santa Claus-like figure, and that Santa Claus-like figure would, instead of bringing presents, would bring them light in the darkness. And so he would travel around to all the little gnomes, and he would hang a lantern on, like, in the roof of their house. I think that's the gable, right? So he'd hang a lantern in everybody's gable on the darkest night. And that accompanying with that, there was a tradition of sort of throwing open your house and serving, food to your neighbors, and people just visiting each other in the little village and giving each other gifts, and just sort of like the kind of thing I would idealize in the perfect little village life that exists in my head. And so that first story, what happens is that while they're waiting for his visit, so he doesn't come till the end of the story, and there's a terrible crisis. The pony farm has a fire, and there's a whole thing. I had to figure out how do you like take the photos of a pony fire on a pony farm on fire. So I use Playmobil, and I use tissue paper and all this stuff. And that first story, though, because it was about bringing light in the darkness, and then basically right around Christmas for most of us, second lockdown happened. Short in Canada and in Manitoba, where I'm from, like 3 weeks before Christmas or whatever, they basically canceled Christmas, right? They locked us right down. And that second one was really hard. Like, that was really grim. And every morning I got up, and 8 a.m., I emailed out this little message about having fun and about, like, just doing something. And the stories I was getting back, there were so many people that lived alone, and this was the only thing they looked forward to at all in January or in December. And the way, because of that, the discussion boards happened, like the way we came together on Ravelry and on Instagram, and like gave each other love and told each other what we were enjoying and what we were struggling with. And then some days, there would be a little bit of a story. And the story was, I didn't plan for the pony farm fire to be as sort of like, in my mind, we'd all be happy and it'd be sort of festive December. And then the pony fire would be like a contrast to our perfect lives and not an embodiment of the actual fire that was our lives at the time. So it was maybe a little more on the nose than I might have chosen had I known what was coming in the future, but I didn't. And I honestly can't read that story without crying to this day, because at the end I wrap it all up with this little message from the Gnome of the North, where he talks about bringing light to the darkness. And like, I just cry every time I read it, although I'm a light touch, I will admit. I am somebody who cries a lot and very easily. And so the stories have become a really important part of it. It started just as a way for me to give people space, because their Decembers were busy, and I wanted to send them something, but not say, here's your homework, here's another chore. I wanted just a little space or a little breather. But now it's getting to the point where I think I'm on my 5th or 6th of these more intense stories, and I'm having to like, wait, who's the mayor again? Like, I've got like, it's almost like my own fantasy universe where I've got like my own lore and I've got my own stuff. And, so like I have to decide it for this December. It's called Nana's Visit, and it's about somebody's Oma or grandma, depending on how you call your Nana, coming to a visit. And I had to decide, is she from another village in the Grimblewoods? Or is she from outside the Grimblewoods? Like, what exists outside the Grimblewoods? And I was like, I can't actually think about that yet. So I just put her in a different village in Grimblewoods because I wasn't ready to like have a second forest. But yeah, so Nana's visit is the next one. And I'm having to go back and be like, wait a minute, I do have like, what are the named characters in these stories? And what are the named locations? And I try to get it right. And I try to figure out how to tell a story. And every story is about love, and it's about connection. It's about forgiveness. It's about joy. Somehow there's always a mistake or something happening. And I just keep bringing it back to like emotional and imaginative awareness is basically what goes on with those stories. And I have a really great time with it.
And I think you bring a really great time to many, many knitters. I enjoyed it so much last December. This was the first time that I actually knitted along during the Knitalong. So it was really nice. And
well, that's usually groundbreaking. Yeah. Like nobody keeps up with a Knitalong, right?
Well, I have my own Knitalong running in December with a piece of the pattern every day. So I am also busy juggling and keeping up with questions and reassuring knitters that it will be all right and just trust the pattern kind of things. And then it's so nice to sit down and just ride along on the gnome adventure that is going that year. So it was a real joy, yeah. And what role does the community play in shaping the direction of your storylines in your mystery Knitalongs? Have any fan interactions influenced your work? Because everyone has something to say about all the gnomes.
Absolutely. I mean, part of it, I've always encouraged people to modify my patterns. So sometimes I'll even see things and go, I wish I'd designed that. And then maybe a few gnomes later, it pops up. So there was someone said, I don't love doing that nose, so I started putting a bauble in. And so I was like, that's a great idea. Do you mind if I use that idea? So like I was getting requests for very little gnomes. And when you go very little, then you go very fiddly. And I was really looking for ways to preserve the adorableness, but not all the steps. So for instance, this little tiny one has a bobble nose, and that's because I saw that from someone modifying one of my patterns. So if you are one of those people out there modifying my patterns, you are feeding my creativity. Sometimes I see it like there's a literal one-to-one. I don't even bother to like redo it. It's like, that is the most brilliant thing. That's happening. And usually if it's a one-to-one, I will ask permission and mention the person. But we're now at the point where there's so many gnomes being knit that it's just all kind of feeding into my creativity. And that's sort of seeing other people's modifications is a big thing. But another really big thing is seeing where people struggle. So if I see in one design, I'm having to answer the same question over and over again, or we're having the same point where the gnome is not looking as beautiful in their version as in my version, I learn from that. I'm like, well, what was it about this thing that I can do, apparently as a knitter, and didn't know it was a skill, or it was something I was changing about how I was knitting versus other people. So like there was one pattern I did where we all had really terrible laddering. And there was just one, like there were certain points up the hat that everybody really struggled with, like a distinct ridge up the pearl fabric. And so when I designed my neck, I wanted to do a cabled pattern, and cables look best against a pearl background. Knowing that in another gnome where we had lots of pearls, we had a communal problem. I put a cable, a little cable, at the place where that junction of needles, or where it was mostly DPN knitters who were having this problem, but where that junction of needles would happen, the first 4 stitches were a cable, so that it wasn't pearl stitches. So sometimes I'm problem solving based on communal problems. Other times it's just jokes. Someone will make a one-off joke, and I'm like, actually, that does exist in the Grimblewoods. I'm writing that in, or whatever. And I mean, it's at the point now where there's just so many interactions and so much creativity and playfulness and all of this that it is. I'm just constantly thinking. Like, there are some gnomes that I have designed for one particular knitter in mind. I'm like, I know she'll like this. And if she'll like it, everybody will be happy. But mostly I'm thinking about her. Because she's written, in the last 2 Knitalongs, she's written, oh, I really hope we do X. And we weren't doing X. I knew that. It was already designed. But then, like, a Knitalong or 2 later, I was like, it is time to do that. She's right. And so I'll put that in. And so it is an enormously interactive design experience. And I mean, now that I'm traveling a bit more and I'm meeting more people, it's sort of like supercharging as people are like making requests or other things. And that's the other thing. I get a lot of requests for, would you design a gnome like this? I'd like a gnome like that. And a lot of times it's tied to holidays. Like, people want a bride and groom gnome for giving as a wedding gift. They want a Valentine's Day gnome. They wanted doctor and nurse gnomes during the pandemic. And I haven't actually responded to any of those like yet. Because for me, the Grimblewoods gnomes are more than just caricatures. They're more than just like, they really live. And so just to design sort of something more for our holidays doesn't feel quite right. But I am thinking that maybe I should do a collection, or like if I do another book, or I don't know, something like that. Maybe there would be a way to, because there is an unmet need clearly for people to have things that are a little more tied so they can decorate or they can gift around those things. But I haven't found the way to make those requests work for how I think about the gnomes and the personalities and the way they kind of live in my life yet.
And what other creative outlets do you have when you are not knitting gnomes?
Thinking about knitting gnomes. I do a lot of my thinking when I'm doing my other hobbies. So I really enjoy endurance activities. So when my husband's body was doing a little better, we were runners and we did long distance running. Now we switched to cycling. So we do like hours of cycling every week. We hike, we do lots of walking. And I mentioned before that I will come home from a walk and like do a bunch of sketching. And there is something about longer term repetitive activities that really free my mind. I can go into like a 3-hour bike ride, and I will know there's a problem in my gnome, and I won't even necessarily be actively thinking about it, and it'll solve itself during the ride because I have nothing else to think about. But I've started recently doing some embroidery, and it's been really wonderful. There's quite an active embroidery guild in town here, more active and organized than the knitters locally. The knitters keep not quite getting a guild going, not quite getting knitting nights going. It's kind of like this weird, I guess we're just more introverted than the embroiderers or something. But I have adopted the local embroidery group. A set of them meet weekly at a coffee shop at the cafe. And so I've adopted them as my knitting group, and they embroider and I knit. But I mean, it's really hard to be beside people pursuing excellence in a craft that is so akin to mine without being like, I could try that. So I am exploring some embroidery right now. It is difficult because anytime I do something that's not knitting, I'm like, but I could be knitting. I could be making a sweater for myself. I could be designing a gnome. I could be, so it's actually a little tricky, but I love photography. I love embroidery. I used to watercolor and sketch a little bit when the kids were younger. But I feel like it's okay to have things that cycle in and out. And knitting seems to have been like a constant now for more than 20 years. And then other things cycle in and out. So right now it's the embroidery and a bit of photography. And then I know watercolor's coming back because there's something so in the moment and gorgeous about when you have that little puddle of water and you just drop a little blue in the side and it shimmers across and you see that gradation and then you add like a little, I just think there's something so like almost like it's enchanted. Like it is not, how can this be a real physical thing that exists? Like this has to be something that only special effects or wizards can do, you know, it just doesn't seem real. And so watercolor, I think, will come back. But I do just like, I like to be producing the things in my life. So we do a lot of handmade gifts. So depending on what people need or want, you know, we'll do spice seasonings, or I'll embroider little tablecloths or little tea towels, or we'll do lots of baking. I think all of life is kind of a creative hobby if you look at it the right way, and if you can find the space for it and like the time and the deep breath, and not to feel like you're hurried. Like almost anything can be creative if you don't try to rush your way through it.
So, yeah, well, finally, how do you hope that your gnome designs impact those who knit them? What do you want them to feel or experience while they knit their little gnome creature?
Oh, that's complicated. There's a bunch of things I want them to experience. One is whimsy and playfulness. I think there is a moment when you sew the nose on and it just kind of pops into its own personality, that it is a moment of sheer delight. But I think a lot of us, we have just messed ourselves up so fundamentally that we've even turned our hobbies into chores, into responsibilities, into jobs. Like I shouldn't cast on another sock until I finish that sweater for my nephew. I shouldn't do this. I should knit up all my stash. You know, that we should ourselves during our free time in our hobbies, and we make rules and we make it like a burden, and that just drives me wild. I do it myself. Like I'm not free from this, but I see it so much when people talking, you know, oh, I shouldn't do that. I shouldn't do this, or I should, you know, knit this before that. And it's like, this is your free time and this is a free choice and you can do whatever you want. And why are we putting in this weird Protestant work ethic, weird judgy creepiness? And so I think gnomes are fun because they're like, there's no good reason to knit a gnome except that it makes you happy. Like gnomes have no function. They're not keeping me warm. Every gnome I knit is a sweater I have not knit. I am still cold every winter.
Is there any design that holds a specific significance for you?
Oh gosh. Oh, that is really difficult. Yes, but I can't think of it right off the top of my head. I will say that the fact that I'm now a published author is a really big deal because, like I said, I wanted to be an author since I was 8, and so the fact that the gnomes are the thing that have brought me to authorship, I think it's just hilarious. You know, like I had such serious dreams of being a fantasy author. I had such serious dreams of being a children's author, and now I'm a gnome author. And so I think the gnomes, like the book itself, I think right now is holding like an incredible significance because I also only just got my copy like 2 weeks ago. And so like the physicality of like the fact that I can do this is amazing.
Yeah.
You know, like this.
I can't wait to receive mine.
And for those of you who speak German, there is a German edition. I just got my German copy. But yeah, like, and you know, like, so this right now is what holds significance. They wanted me to do the photos. And I said, I'd like to bring my dad in on this. My father is a former agricultural researcher, but he now is a photographer. And so he does landscapes. And so we have very different photographic styles. I like the smallest possible part of a forest. Like I'm like, ooh, how tiny is that mushroom? That's what I want a picture of. And my dad takes pictures that are like, he'll print it and it will be like 3 meters long and a meter tall, and it'll be like a whole panorama of the prairie sky or something like that. And my gnome wouldn't even be like a speck in that photo. So, but Dad knows a lot about the technicality of photography, whereas I'm very much like an instinct person. And, you know, so like the quality might not always be good enough for the book or whatever. So my dad and I worked on the pictures together, and seeing the photos and remembering the jokes we were making, and the way our fingers were getting colder and colder, and like we couldn't bend our fingers, him to like take the picture and me to like do what we needed to do with the gnome or whatever. But like, so you know, there's just, they put so many photos in the book, and I'm so excited. So I would say that right now is what's holding such significance, because it represents more than a year of work.
Yeah.
That almost every member of my family had a say in. Like I was polling opinions about color choice. I was polling opinions about names, about little stories, about, you know, like, how big do you think the biggest gnome in the book should be? You know, we just, everybody in my family was involved in some way, even if it wasn't as tangibly as, say, my dad with taking photos.
Yeah, well, like I said, I can't wait to receive my book. It is in pre-order, and I am so curious to go through it and to see how it actually worked out. So yeah, well, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to me, and I hope that a lot of people will enjoy watching this and hear you speak about your gnomes and your experiences. I really appreciate it, and
I loved it.
yeah,
Thank you so much.
well, yeah, you're welcome. Okay, bye bye.